A young man sits around his campfire, and the leader of his Boy Scout troop, a 40-year-old man they lovingly refer to as Mr. Cheese because he roasts Gouda instead of marshmallows over the campfire, starts telling a story.
You know these woods, kids? Do you know what happened here? Nothing ever happens in this crappy town,
chimed back a young man.
Now, boy, you'd better shut your mouth. You don't have a clue what you're talking about. In these woods, 50 years ago, a boy like you went missing, and they never found him. But see, I know what happened to that kid. We all do. You don't need to find a body to know when the big man gets somebody.
At this, the young boy looked down at his feet. He did know what Mr. Cheese was talking about. And after taking a bite of his gooey Gouda goodness, the cheese chimed back at the children.
Kids, they didn't find a body. They didn't find any clothing. The dogs couldn't even find the boy's scent more than 100 feet from camp. This campsite. But you know what they did find? Big footprints. I'm not talking size 13 either. I'm talking size 22 quintuple width. Boys, you'd better watch out and stay in your tents tonight, or I swear I won't be held accountable if something happens to you.
With that, the campfire was reduced to embers and the children went to bed. But the smart-mouthed young boy from earlier couldn't sleep. He was tossing and turning, and his mind was wandering. But finally, after a couple of hours, he found himself drifting off to bed. That is, until he heard a loud crack of something large stepping on a stick deep into the woods. Welcome, my friends, to the channel where we never sleep when we're camping in the woods, because that story you just heard around the campfire, well, we know it's based on something a bit more realistic than you'd like to think. If you're smart, you'd stay awake and certainly stay in the light of the fire. Now, personally, my affinity for campfire stories grew from my time in Boy Scouts in my youth, where I'd listen in wonder as the Scoutmasters told us terrifying tales about the horrors of the woods right around us, before promptly ordering us to get a good night's rest. Today, because all of this talk around campfires inspired this entire channel, I thought it would be appropriate to dig a bit deeper. See, ever since humans discovered fire, they changed, and so did their lives. And today I'm going to share with you just how meaningful this tradition of campfire stories truly is, in this documentary detailing a short history of campfire stories. It's thought that about 400,000 years ago, humans learned to control and harness fire. This changed everything. With this development, it's been shown by anthropologists, for instance Richard Wrangham, that humans were able to cook food, eat substantially more food, and survive cold nights and harsher conditions. This not only enabled survival, but allowed their guts to grow larger, and perhaps more importantly, allowed us humans to develop larger brains. Fires also allowed our ancestors to ward off predators with the orange glow of the fire, and they allowed our ancestors' productivity to increase, changing their sleep patterns and their circadian rhythm, as they would stay awake longer into the previously impenetrable darkness of night. The ability to harness fire also developed a new role among groups of early humans, the firekeepers. Now, firekeepers weren't lone individuals. It's actually hypothesized that they were an organized group, with some tending to the fire and others searching for wood, creating an opportunity for coordination in a space that previously would have been used for sleep. With all of this new activity around a fire at night, new behaviors began to form that may have started when our ancestors were sitting around the campfire together. Sitting around a communal fire gave them a way to expand their imaginations and share stories in a way that wasn't easy, or at least was not pleasant during the daylight hours, when they were likely hunting, gathering, and otherwise working. The fire not only provided light, it actually changed our brain chemistry, interfering with natural melatonin production and the circadian rhythm I mentioned earlier. And as you'd expect, that is the mechanism that allowed people to stay awake later into the night. Anthropologist Polly Weissner actually wondered whether this created newfound leisure time and, dare I say, space for social interaction that had previously never happened in human history. She actually argued in a paper published in the Publications of the National Academy of Science that these conversations at night around a fire were fundamentally different from daytime conversations. Her thoughts on the matter were that people were generally more open at night to one another, and while during a day we paid keen attention to each other's facial expressions, at night while we were sitting by the fire, these faces were concealed as silhouettes. This opinion was developed by months of conversations that Wiesner witnessed while living alongside a group of Namibia and Botswana natives. While recording conversations of these people, she was trying to learn about the interactions of the community and how it differed throughout the day. These conversations were between different people, groups of adults and children, and they usually lasted 20 to 30 minutes. During these recordings, she kept note of the content of their conversations. Out of 122 daytime conversations, she found that 31% were devoted to discussion of economic matters, foraging, hunting, or technology. 34% were devoted to criticism, complaint, or conflict. 16% were jokes, and only 6% were stories. At night, however, 81% of these conversations were about stories, where rather than their conversations revolving around anger and disputes, they would consider the past, talk about group gatherings that were happening far away, and discuss their forefathers, traveling to another world, so to speak. From these stories, she mentioned that she thought the multi-generational audience attending the campfires would learn about their society, the rules of marriage and kinship, and also tradition. These stories also taught about empathy. Admittedly, these native groups she spent time with, even by her account, were not the same as our ancient ancestors, but they're probably as close to an analogy as we can observe in modern day. Her main takeaway generally seemed to be that these mellow or even somber moments around the fire were probably more intimate than the interactions that occurred throughout the day, completely altering the social interactions that humans had with one another. It's not hard to imagine, with the influence of the firelight, that early humans developed much of their culture, stories of gods and heroes, song and dance, and debatably, most important of all, storytelling. Now, moving to modern day, it's said that the origin of the modern campfire story started to rear its head in the late modern period, which is the 1800s to 1945, where it may have been a useful tactic that soldiers and frontiersmen used to stay awake when it was their turn to play lookout at camp. Not only would the light of the fire inhibit melatonin formation, as we discussed earlier, but it would encourage them to tell tales that taught lessons, or perhaps those that scared them, or that they maybe didn't even understand. They also told tales of bravery around these fires, though, and it's known that in North America, as early as the 1840s, the term campfire story began being used and associated with stories told about wartime exploits back at the military camp. They'd also often retell these stories at their reunions with fellow wartime service members during peace times. Also, during this period in the late 1800s, ads, journals, and lectures started including the term campfire story. And at a similar time, the term began to be associated with tales of encounters with dangerous game, like bears, buffalo, panthers, and snakes. It's through these traditions that the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts of America actually adopted these practices from the military. This was a pervasive enough tradition that in the third chapter of the first edition of the Boy Scouts of America official handbook, the chapter on campcraft, there were notes about campfire entertainment, including some about storytelling, with example stories in the book telling tales of ghosts, wartime stories, detective stories, stories of heroism, Native American legends, and even tales about the stars. The idea of what a campfire story actually was evolved from its inclusion in scouting, broadening the idea of what a campfire story could be, and also bringing the philosophical idea of a campfire story from wartime atmospheres back to the general public. Additionally, the nature of youth telling these stories brought them to less mature topics, such as stories of the supernatural that would often strike fear in these younger, more impressionable groups. This would ultimately lead to the spooky variety of campfire story that has overtaken the more mature and lesson-driven campfire stories of old that were told by soldiers and settlers. Author William W. Forgey, in his 1984 book, Campfire Stories, Things That Go Bump in the Night, noted that the most requested campfire tales of all time were actually ones that evoke fear. With this in mind, he gave tips on telling a good story, including the following points. If you want to tell a good campfire story, you must enjoy the practice, maintain eye contact, keep in close contact with the audience, not obsess over details, set a quiet mood prior to the story, utilize the energy of the audience, maintain the campfire, that one's kind of funny, forego props or scare tactics, these distract from the story, use different vocal inflections, and start sessions with believable tales to build credibility. These rules aren't so different than many rules I've heard about good storytelling in general, tips that I could learn from, frankly. Now, with the exception of the crackle of the fire, the rustling of nearby trees, and the sounds of wildlife setting a scene that no theater could recreate, campfire stories differ across the world and across cultures. While they may be unified in the sense that they're all generally communal events meant to strengthen our bonds with one another and create a sense of unity, they vary among different groups of people. Here, I'm going to share with you some examples of campfire traditions from a few cultures scattered throughout the globe, some of which are well into the past. Perhaps the fire's comforting influence is exactly why it was a central figure of holidays like the ancient Celtic celebration Samhain. Now, if you know anything about Halloween, you'll know its precursor holiday was a festival called Samhain that was approximately a day when the dead walked the world. You could walk into their world, and they could enter ours. It wasn't fun and games like today's Halloween either, but scarier and more threatening. Folks would do their best to keep themselves safe on this holiday by appeasing the dead through rituals like setting a table at dinner that evening for departed loved ones, but also by starting large communal bonfires, which were said to offer protection and even cleanse the spirit. They'd even put out their homes' fires and relight them with transplanted fire from these communal bonfires, sometimes even putting two bonfires next to one another and walking between them to cleanse themselves. Now, I can't necessarily say scientifically this is the case, but given the intoxicating impact the fire is purported to have on human interactions, I can't help but speculate that this is why they felt the firelight might offer some protection and perhaps alleviate the influence of the fear of the long gone and perhaps their real fear of the oncoming long night. See, Samhain, while masked as a Day of the Dead-like holiday, was really just the beginning of the dark half of the Celtic year. A time when crops couldn't grow, when days were colder, and the nights were frigid. And a time when, inevitably, living would be more perilous, and the days would be shortened. The campfire and these legends around it may have been a celebration of sorts, to make the Celts feel more comfortable in the days leading into what would have inevitably been a hard time of the year. Another famous bonfire you've probably heard of is the Yule log. Historically, the Norse and Scandinavians started celebrating Yule in mid-November, a festivity that also began around the time that the Celt dark half of the year did, referring to it as Yule. Nowadays, a Yule log is a cake made to look like a log, but originally it was indeed a real log used in the fire of this celebration. This log was often inscribed with runes and illustrations of their gods, calling for good fortune in the following years. And often the logs they used were of oak trees that would burn hot all night to chase the darkness away, much like the bonfires of Samhain. Now, it's worth keeping in mind that this group of people was largely illiterate at the time, so how do you think history was passed on, from generation to generation? Through stories told around a fire, of course. During Yule, the town's best storytellers would often come together, I presume around the log, and among the sparks whispering away above the fire, they would paint pictures about their gods, traditions, or adventures undertaken by their kin. It's also said that around this log they would feast, with the eyes of the community drawn to the fire rather than the potential gluttony going on around them. Perhaps in part inspired by the traditions of Yule, semi-modern day Christians also used to tell stories around campfires with frequency. You've heard the song, "It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year" by Andy Williams, right? Remember his lyric, "There'll be scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago." Well, let's soak this in for a second. When's the last time you remember telling ghost stories on Christmas? I'll wait. For most of us, this tradition probably wasn't a part of our lives, but that's largely because modern Christian practices are an amalgamation of many traditions, cultural and spiritual beliefs from many cultures, and some of those cultures have died off over time. A few hundred years ago, particularly in England, this wasn't the case though. Nights still began early, starting in the later portion of the year, and where better to spend these nights than huddled around a campfire with your family and friends. As a bonus point, storytelling didn't require literacy, which at the time was a fairly uncommon thing. In the mid-1800s, the tradition of Christmas stories was actually sort of jump-started too, by Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which, if you think about it, is in fact a Christmas ghost story, with 3 ghosts coming to visit old Ebenezer. This tale sort of sent ghost stories rocketing from an obscure Christmas tradition that had been mostly forgotten to a trendy thing to do around the Christmas season. This gained so much popularity that well-known authors of the time were actually writing ghost stories throughout the year to print for Christmas to be told around the fire. Their interest in these stories was believed to be in part because of England's fall as a superpower at the time, giving English citizens a generally dark outlook on life. They also strove to be relatable, including characters from the working class in many of them. Sadly, this tradition did not successfully transplant to America, largely because of early America's Puritan outlook on the world, finding this sort of tradition, or really Christmas in general, to be blasphemous. Here in pre-Western America, and into the modern day, campfire storytelling also played a role in native life, and maintains this role into modern day. Times around the fire were often when elders passed information, including cultural heritage, along to the rest of their communities. A common scene among some native tribes could be the imagery of a group of individuals huddled around a fire in a longhouse that would be holding almost 100 people. The stories they'd tell would include tales of the everyday, but also tell of the mystical and mythical events that had happened in the past to their people. This would teach their kin about history and tradition, in addition to their creation stories. And this storytelling would often even include performance in the form of song and dance to illustrate these traditional tales to onlookers. An example of this sort of story is the common story of fire that tells of a time long ago, when the young world was cold and wet, without abundant food. This all changed, though, when the thunderbird flew over the land, striking an oak tree with lightning before flying away. A young brave saw an ember left behind which beckoned him to bring the ember wood, which in response led to this wood catching aflame. The fire got greedy after this, growing more and more as the child continued to feed it. The fire got so large it was almost out of control, and the young brave realized what was occurring, and he stopped giving it wood, letting it die down to embers yet again. The young brave eventually brought one of the embers back to his tribe, sharing his story, and this lesson with them, that the fire got hungry and you should never feed it too much. This led to the discovery of fire for the tribe, which would let them cook food, keep warm, and ward off animals. In Japan, while many of the same themes prevail, there are also distinct differences, such as a ceremonial bonfire burnt on New Year's celebrations. During these bonfires, oddly similar to Samhain in a way, sacred objects are burnt in the bonfire to purify and cleanse those that provide the items, and to provide them a fresh start in the upcoming year. Also, perhaps even more akin to Samhain is a celebration named Obon. Obon, a holiday influenced by the Buddhist Ghost Festival and the Taoist Zhongyuan Festival, is generally a festival to honor spirits of their ancestors, and it's sort of evolved into a holiday where folks go to their ancestral family homes to clean and visit their ancestors' graves. During this time, it's said that their ancestors' spirits actually visit these altars. There's also a ritual that takes place during this festival that directly translates to sending fire, which will permanently send their ancestors' spirits to their dwelling place. If you look up images of this festival, you'll also find more fires than just large bonfires, with individuals lighting lanterns, which line streets and hang above them over the course of the festival's evenings, giving everything a firelit glow. Now, while I don't necessarily endorse this risky behavior, during the Chinese New Year, there's also a prolific tradition of lighting bonfires and jumping over them in northern China. Sometimes this tradition entails rapidly running through a raging fire instead, and from what I can tell, it directly translates to English to playing with fire. This risky ritual begins every year with a ceremony where individuals pray for good fortune in the new year, followed by a parade, and then the daredevils themselves start darting across and over fires, often doused with water for good measure. The act is said to honor a deity and also as a prayer for good fortune, or sometimes a cleansing ritual for the new year. Anyways, I just thought this video would be a fun change of pace from what I've usually been up to. I certainly can't come up with a 2-hour-long video every week, and I just thought I'd give myself a little break from the insanity of compiling one of those. Also, if you haven't noticed, something crazy just happened here. I just hit 1,000 subscribers. That's an entire small town that has decided to watch this channel. I'm super excited and honestly, frankly, honored that you would all choose to be a part of this tiny little channel, and I really can't thank you enough for helping me get to this point. Who knows, maybe in a couple of years you'll be able to say you were one of the originals. Maybe I can optimistically say that I'm excited for my next milestone of 10,000, and who knows, maybe 100,000 will come next. I'm really eyeing that silver play button, and I'm not going to stop till I get there. Anyways, whether you just heard a crackle in the woods, or saw some creature standing at the edge of your campfire watching you, waiting for the firelight to fade, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.